Okay, so first of all, thank you for that introduction, Richard. I just want to say I think Science for Peace is a really great organization. I've been to many of the events like this one that Science for Peace has organized, and I've learned a lot at these Science for Peace fora. So it's quite an honor now to be the keynote speaker for this event, and I'm happy to see so many people here. So now, if we can move to the slides, I guess. Oh, okay, good. I have control over this. Okay. So I guess the first question is, what makes a situation an emergency? I mean, normally when we think of emergencies, there's an accident. People are profusely bleeding. They need immediate medical attention or they're going to die, right? Or there's a fire. You need to get the firefighters there right away or your whole house burns down. Or the river is rising and you need to get sandbags deployed quickly, right? There's usually some imminent threat of some major catastrophe, and you've got to act right away to prevent it, okay? So does our warming climate, global warming, apply? Most of the impacts of global warming are still decades into the future. Now we're getting some samples, isolated events here and there, fires in Australia, flooding in Europe, or in Canada for that matter. But by and large, the impacts are still a long way away, right? The climate is still changing relatively slowly. So what makes it an emergency? I think what makes it an emergency is how much time we have to act to prevent something that is still quite some way off, and how long it takes, right, to make the changes relative to the amount of time that we have. I think that's what really makes it the emergency. So I've tried to sum that up with these words. It's an emergency because the time we have left is very short compared to the time required to take the actions needed to avert otherwise inevitable catastrophic consequences. We have to change the entire energy system, and not just that, we have to change social norms and values and the way people think. And that's perhaps even harder. It takes a long time to do that, and we don't really have a lot of time. In fact, in many respects, it's already too late, right? Some of the things we're contemplating now, we should have been undertaking in earnest 30 years ago, 40 years ago. And we had the science then to know we had a real threat. Okay, so here is an overview of what's been happening. This is the trend in fossil fuel or industrial CO2 emissions for the last 60 years. And it's more or less a straight line up. In spite of the resolutions and the concern and the talk and the measures here and there that governments are doing, it's pretty much heading straight up. And in fact, slightly steeper, slightly faster in the last few decades, okay? If we want to stabilize the climate at 1.5 degrees warming, those emissions have to follow that blue line. They have to go to net zero in 20 years. Or the 2-degree target, we need to go to net zero by 2055 or so. Okay, so we've got to turn this somehow into that. Well, the first stage would be if we could levelize the emissions. The emissions are going up. If we could levelize the emissions, would that solve the problem? No. The concentration would continue to grow, just at a slower rate. The concentration grows as long as there's more going into the atmosphere than you're taking out. So if you want to stabilize, next step, stabilize the concentration of CO2, you've got to reduce the emissions to the point where what goes in equals what comes out. So that means dropping them by 50%, right? So now if you stabilize the concentration, does that stabilize the climate? No, because those gases already there, they have a heating effect, right? And the climate hasn't caught up to that. So even after stabilizing emissions and then stabilizing concentration, we still haven't stabilized the climate. The climate keeps warming. So if you actually want to stabilize the climate, now you've got to reduce the concentrations. The more you bring them down, the less the warming the climate will plateau at, okay? So that's why you see emissions need to go actually to zero, okay, if you want to stabilize the climate. But is that the end of the situation? If we stabilize the climate, what happens to sea level? It keeps on rising because, okay, the climate's not getting any warmer. The glaciers are melting now. They won't melt at a faster rate, but just wait 1,000 years and you'll get 5, 6, 10 meters sea level rise. So you see what I mean when I say it's kind of too late for some things, and it takes a long, long time to make even the changes that I've been talking about. Okay, so now, so this summarizes, and for the sake of those who may want to download this presentation later, this just summarizes what I've said, right? We've got a sort of a nested sequence of problems. Stabilize emissions, stabilize concentration, stabilize climate, and in 1,000 years we might stabilize sea level. Okay? So where are we heading? That orangey curve, right? This is the IPCC trajectory to the end of the century. Where would we like to go if we can hit that net zero by 2050 target? There's the 2 degrees, okay? This is where we would like to end up in 2100, warming of 0.5 degree to 1 degree in much of the world. 3, 4 degrees in the polar regions, we'll settle for that. But this is where we're heading, okay? 2, 3, 4 degrees in the tropics, 10, 12 degrees in higher latitudes. So it's really a question of this future going all out versus that future. Now, this slide actually contains a lot of information. The black curve at the top is like that first curve I showed you, the CO2 emissions going straight up in a straight line and continuing for several decades, and then maybe by the end of the century plateauing and then starting their way down. Where we need to go, the blue line is net emissions, but really, how do we get that net zero? Most people don't foresee fossil fuel emissions actually going to zero for a very long time. So you need to create negative emissions, compensating emissions. So this could be bioenergy that you grow and then you combust it and capture the CO2 and bury it. It could be reforestation. It could be building up soil carbon. It could be direct capture of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and sequestering it, or various things like that. So you see the green is the reduction in emissions. The gray are the remaining emissions. The blue are the various negative emissions that would need to be created. And then that blue line is the net zero, which in this case, we don't reach till 2070, which actually isn't soon enough. We need to head there by 2050, so it's an even harder task. Okay, now, just so that you're not completely depressed and think that there's no hope, there are some glimmers of hope. This is the trend in wind generating capacity worldwide, and it's really taken off in the last 10 years. There have been breathtaking and really unforeseen, more rapid than foreseen decreases in the cost of wind energy, right? And the same thing applies to solar. It has just exploded even in the last 5 years. So if we crank that up and keep that going for another 10 or 20 years, we pretty much solve the electricity part of the problem, okay? But there are, of course, other big parts of the problem that we have to deal with. Okay, so now in the last few minutes, I just want to talk about sort of some of the overarching strategies and actually address some of the different focuses or differences of opinion that may exist among different groups, and also referring to some of the signs and posters I see at the Fridays for Future strike, the student strikes that I've been participating in whenever I've been physically around. So I guess one of the issues is system change or systemic change versus individual behavioral change. Do we need to overthrow or replace capitalism? Some people think so, and certainly capitalism it seems to be going from one excess to another these days. Or are there ways that we could reform it, right? That would make a big difference. And should we focus on energy only, or do we need to also focus on energy and diet? Do we need to go to net zero fossil fuels, or do we also need to move as close as we can to zero animal food products? So what do people mean? What could it mean when they say system change? Well, change the electricity system, okay? That's a huge monumental task, but I think if we treated this climate problem as an emergency, I think it could be done in 30 years. I think it's to basically eliminate fossil fuels, or 90% eliminate from the electricity system worldwide. I think that's doable in 30 years, 40 years maximum. It means completely rebuilding the whole electricity system, putting in storage, new transmission, the whole bit. There's a lot involved, okay? But it's actually a solved problem. We pretty much know what needs to be done from an engineering point of view. The transportation system, we certainly need to change that. We need a lot more transit, and maybe entirely new vehicles, although I'll just say I'm not quite so keen on electric vehicles as the solution. I think we need to do a lot more than that. The whole industrial production process, the movement towards the circular economy and vastly greater and more efficient ways of doing things. But let me just say that this is a really complicated, intertwined issue. And actually, it's impossible to have a strictly circular economy. It's just not possible thermodynamically. But as close as we can get actually requires huge behavioral and organizational changes, which depend on sort of a different kind of behavior. So there's a large behavioral component to that. Maybe people, when they say we need system change, we need to move away from an economy that depends on never-ending growth, and I'm certainly all in favor of that. The corporate culture, which values profit above all else. I mean, it's just incredible, the complete and total callous disregard for people, for ecosystems, for the future, for the planet. All of that is put aside if profit is threatened, right? It's just such a perversion of any sensible way of doing things. Okay, so I think basically, yes, there are things in the system that need to be changed, but behavior still has a big role to play, okay? If you look at sort of the breakdown of our emissions, 20% of it or so is related to food consumption, and there's a huge difference between a high meat diet versus at the other extreme, a vegan diet, and so anywhere in between. And if you add it up, you and I, we can directly control a good 50% of the emissions, and we can make good choices or bad choices, which are at least a factor of 2 difference. So that means altogether at least a 25% impact under the direct influence of all of us. So that's nothing to dismiss. And behavioral change can occur quickly. At times of energy shortage or energy spikes, it has happened quickly, okay? And it's relatively low cost and uncomplicated compared to what it's entailed for some of these other changes, right, that I've been talking about. The other thing, too, is, okay, so in principle, we can continue wasting electricity, over air conditioning our houses, and just put up enough wind and solar, right, to supply that electricity need. But then, there's no free lunch, right? And we could have biomass energy, but there's no free lunch. By reducing our overall demands, by buying things and making them last, by being efficient, we are reducing the impact of the solutions to the global warming problem, which could be wind or solar or biomass or things that require mining, right? So I think if you want to address more than one question, more than one problem at once. If you don't want the cure to be worse than the disease, so to speak, I think we need to deal with the questions of our consumption, right, which is related to our behavior. So I've felt very strongly that it's important on all of us to behave in a way that minimizes our impact, that treats life with respect and dignity. And okay, now let me just say a few things about capitalism. First of all, we don't have time to replace it or overthrow it, but I think there are a few changes that could actually make a big difference. And I was actually talking to various colleagues in different departments over the last summer, and it was an opportunity to just get together for a nice cappuccino outside in the sun. And so I don't have time to elaborate on this, but I think stock options have to go, right? Just Google what they are if you don't know. Not only are they distorting moral behavior, economists argue that it's really not in the long-term health of the corporations to compensate senior executives in that way. It just distorts their decision-making in a way that has a whole bunch of nefarious effects. So stock options have to go. Another thing that would change corporate behavior real fast is if CEOs face the prospect of jail terms for things that are actually crimes. And also if we could expand what counts as a crime, because there's a guy named Harry Gleesback who's a law professor at York, and I read a book called, I don't even remember the name of the book, but anyway, he's written a book pointing out that there are things that you and I do. If we do them, we go to jail. If the corporation does the same thing, it's not a crime, right? So we need to prosecute people for criminal behavior. And I think another part of the problem is a lot of this callous behavior of corporations is related to taking advantage of differences in tax laws or differences in environmental standards or labor standards. So if you have uniform tax laws, uniform environmental standards, and if you face the prospect of jail, and if you correct the way they're compensated, that will lead to big changes in corporate behavior, and particularly a lot of the resistance, right, which is a part of the problem, is corporate resistance to the things that need to be done. Okay, and then finally, the role of diet. You see a lot of the non-CO2 emissions, methane and N2O, which are significant additional contributors to the warming problem, are related to animal agriculture. Okay, so now if you want to go to net zero, right, and if you have methane emissions, you've got to compensate that as well as the CO2. The animal agriculture but you need land to do that, right? With animal agriculture, you're using a lot of land, and you have more that has to be compensated with yet further land requirements, right? So there's sort of a double whammy. If we can reduce the amount of CO2 or greenhouse gases that need to be offset and increase the availability of land through reforestation, right, that can create that negative sink. Because I don't think high-tech direct air capture is the best way to create the negative sink we need. I think good old-fashioned plants, okay? The biosphere and building up soil carbon. Okay. And so I guess the other piece of good news that I see is there's a growing conversation about the role of diet and its impact on climate, not to mention health and animal ethics. And so this is the Canadian Food Guide, which is the new food guide, which is just one of many sort of indications of the changing consciousness about this part of the problem as well. Okay, so I guess I've just, that's it. Right, okay. We don't have time for the Canadian issue. It's the tar sands. Right. Okay.
Talk about
Pardon? Oh, okay. Well, the point is, it's simple arithmetic. There is no hope in hell of Canada meeting its 2030 target unless we phase out altogether the tar sands. I mean, we have this hysterical political discussion over the prospect of slowing down the growth in the expansion, right, of the tar sands, when simple arithmetic tells you you've got to phase them out altogether. If you don't want to phase them out, right, the emission reductions you need in the rest of the economy are like nothing we haven't seen yet. Okay? So this is just arithmetic. Now, we know the government has a major decision, right, this month or next month with this tech project, right? Are they going to approve yet another expansion of the tar sands?
No.
Well, if they do, well, we know, it just confirms that I think we've thought all along about this government, okay? Okay, so that's that.